So hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be talking about mediation with LGBTQ people. If you don't think that you signed up for this group, then you might be in the wrong spot. So we're going to be talking a lot about, what does LGBTQ mean and these types of things. So I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Wolf Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Conflict Resolution Center of St. Louis. My pronouns are either they, them, or zir. And so just to start off, just a quick little bit about who is Conflict Resolution Center. So at its core, we are community members and peers first. So we are members of the St. Louis region who imagine a world more full of peace and more full of fairness. So we like to think of ourselves as educators and learners on conflict resolution skills, tools, and techniques. So it's not enough to just teach it, right, or to do it, but we also are actively trying to learn new skills. And so this presentation is part of an ongoing series of trainings to allow that. We're also advocates for neutrality and fairness, right? So we believe that mediation is around creating a space where parties are equal and the mediator is able to be neutral, right? And so we advocate for neutrality and fairness in the process. And then lastly, and what some people might say is most important, is that we are mediators. So we will facilitate dialogue between folks who are in conflict. We're supported by the City of St. Louis Department of Human Services. And so our services are completely free to St. Louis City residents and employees. So some of the questions that we're going to be working on today, I'm going to move my little participant box, is we're going to be answering these three questions at its core. So number one, what does LGBTQ plus mean, right? What does the acronym mean? And kind of a subpart of that is why should you care? Number two, how does being LGBTQ impact mediations, right? And then number three, what can you do to better work with LGBTQ plus clients, right? These are what we might call best practices. So we're gonna go ahead and get started with this first question of what does LGBTQ plus mean and why should you care, right? And I wanna preface this by noting that you might have seen this in other iterations. You might have seen LGBT, or you might have heard of just the gay community, right? Or you might see LGBTQIA+, right? There's lots of different ways that folks will talk about the community. And so this is just one of those acronyms. So I'm actually gonna start us off with a little poll. So in just a second, you'll see it pop up on your screen. And what I'd like you to answer is, how would you rate your experience with LGBTQ plus identities? Right? So you can see a lot of folks have LGBTQ friends who've shared their experiences, right? So that means that many of us have quite a bit of familiarity, but we're also seeing some folks who know maybe a little bit less and some folks who know a little bit more. So I do want to acknowledge that we're all going to be coming from different places. We're all going to have a different kind of base of knowledge, and that's okay, right? We celebrate that because we're all learning together. I'm giving this presentation not because I'm an expert on all things LGBTQ. It is my field of study, but there is no truth and expert on experience, right? And so someone's experience will always be different than what I say or I think. And so I just want to acknowledge that we're all learning together. So I'm gonna stop sharing the results. And we're gonna start with a little conversation on pronouns, right? So pronouns are the words that we use when we're talking about a person, place, or thing, but we don't want to repeat the name of it over and over, right? So if I'm talking about someone, sometimes it can feel a little cumbersome to use their name every time I reference them. And so usually we'll use pronouns. And so up here, I have some common pronouns that folks use. So the first set, she, her, hers. These are what we often refer to as feminine pronouns. So she, her, hers, feminine pronouns. The second set, he, him, his, these are masculine pronouns. You all are probably very familiar with these, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them. Right? The third one are they, the third set of pronouns is they, them, theirs. These are what we call neutral pronouns, right? But I want to separate between what we call third person plural and third person singular, which for those who are not word geeks, right? The difference between talking about a group of people and talking about one person. So a lot of times you might interact with someone who does not identify with masculine or feminine pronouns. And they might say, myself included, that they use neutral pronouns, right? They, them, theirs is a neutral pronoun to refer to one person. And some folks will get really prickly about this. They'll say, no, they, them, theirs is groups of people only. And the truth of the matter is they, them, theirs has been used to refer to one person, one third party person since the 1400s. Number two, we use it a lot in colloquialism. So if you're talking about someone, you'd be like, oh yeah, I was out with my friend and they were telling me about their, their dog, right? Usually we don't even think about it and it's a common default. And then the third kind of answer to that, oh, well, you can't use that to refer to one person is, would you rather be right or respectful? So just some things to consider. The fourth set of pronouns, these are another set of neutral pronouns, and they're pronounced z, zir, zirs. And they work a lot like she, her, hers. So if you would say, she went to the store, I went with her, this bag of groceries is hers. You might say, Z went to the store, I went with Zir, this bag of groceries is Zir's. So the same kind of structure there. Sometimes people say, so Wolf, what's the difference between they, them, theirs, and Z, Zir, Zir's? And I say, you're asking a great question, and it's going to be what feels most comfortable to the person you're talking to. So some people will say their pronouns are they, them, theirs because that's what's most comfortable, or because that's what most people understand. So sometimes, someone might use pronouns different from what you'd expect, but they choose one that they think will be easiest for you to understand, sometimes. Some people have called these preferred pronouns, but that language is really not right because pronouns aren't preferred, right? They're not necessarily a choice. And so we call them personal pronouns. So you might say my pronouns or my personal pronouns are, one of these. Or you might ask someone, and we have a policy of asking all clients kind of these questions. What are your pronouns? So that we can address you respectively or respectfully, sorry. So, and I also put its pronouns up here primarily because these have been used derogatorily against members of the LGBTQ community, right? And so it's just to acknowledge that people are not generally an it, right? And referring to someone that way is going to be offensive.
Oh, I just wanted to know if you wanted us to put our personal pronouns by our name. If I can figure out how to do it, I'll do it.
So great question, actually. And that's kind of one of our best practices. So you kind of jumped the gun on that one. But a really easy thing that you can do to ensure that folks in a Zoom call feel comfortable, who might identify with pronouns other than you'd expect, is to put the pronouns after your name, kind of like I've done. So if you see my little picture, you'll see Wolf Smith, parentheses, they/them. Really, really easy tactic to just flag to folks, that you understand that pronouns are important. And most everyone else, they don't understand, and so they just ignore it. So it's a very low risk tactic.
Oh, okay. My question was on the Z, Zir, Zirs. for clarity. So these theirs refers to she, her, hers, but not to he, him, his.
Not quite. So zers is a neutral pronoun. So it's used to refer to someone who is usually non-binary or genderqueer, and we'll talk more about those terms if folks are unfamiliar.
Okay.
But the way that it works in a sentence is a lot like she, hers. So I don't make the comparison to say, oh, these are the same, as much as how it works in a sentence is the same, what's the word, conjugation, I believe, as she, her, hers.
Okay, thanks.
Does that help clarify some?
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Awesome. So now I'm going to stop the recording. So now that we move more into this, what does LGBTQ mean, right? I'm showing you what we call the gender unicorn, which might be a little overwhelming. And I know it certainly is for me the first time that I've seen it. So I'm going to actually cut the arrows. So it just looks like categories. We're going to start here, right? So when we think about the LGBTQ community, there's a lot of identities there that are addressing a lot of different things. And so it's helpful to break them down into kind of these components, right? So the first is what we call gender identity. And this is the gender that you identify with, right? Some people say that this is the gender that you go to bed as. So if someone says, what gender are you? You know, it's the one that you're like, I am this. Right? The next one is gender expression. And this one is how we express our gender to the world. And if we think about gender expression, there's a whole lot of components. There's hair, there's facial hair, there's makeup, there's jewelry, there's clothes, there's walking and talking and gesticulating, right? All of these things come together to affect gender expression. Sometimes someone's gender identity and gender expression align, and sometimes they don't. The third component is what we call sex assigned at birth, or what others call biological sex. And this is the makeup of the body. Right? And what we know is we often think about sex as male or female, but about 1 in 1,000 babies are actually intersex. And what intersex means is they are born with a combination of male and female sex characteristics, because biological sex contains chromosomes, hormones, right? Reproductive organs and pseudo-productive organs, right? So primary and secondary sex characteristics, et cetera, right? So biological sex is this kind of like whole hodgepodge of stuff. Right. So we think about male and female, but a significant amount of folks, 1 in 1,000 is quite a lot, are born intersex. Okay. So then we think about physical and emotional attraction, right? And this is who is someone attracted to. And attraction is not the same as behavior, right? I am sure that there are many of you that have seen lots of kind of media about someone who is very attracted to someone, but not willing to act on it, right? Or not acting on it. So when we think about the LGBTQ community, we are thinking about folks using these different kind of categories, right? And so if I take a step back, it becomes kind of like a map where folks are being all over the map. So we've got a lot of folks who are all over the map put together under one umbrella, which we call the LGBTQ plus community. Okay. So normally I would play a little game here called Shout Out, but it's far less fun on Zoom. So we're just going to go through these pretty quickly, kind of what each letter means. So L, as many of you probably know, means lesbian, right? And a lesbian is usually, I'm going to give very short definitions. Know that these definitions are not all inclusive. I'm just trying to give us some shared understanding. So usually someone who identifies as a lesbian is someone who identifies as a woman and is attracted to other women. Okay. So if someone says, I'm a lesbian, usually that's what they're telling you. There are some folks who identify as a lesbian, but do not identify as women. They might identify as non-binary. So again, these are generalizations with a lot of nuance. I love talking about nuance, but also I know that that can be a little overwhelming. So we're more than happy to have like another like round table or lunch to chat about that. So G stands for gay. Generally, this means someone who's attracted to the same gender. So they might say gay man or gay woman, right? Gay is an adjective, not a noun. So you wouldn't say that someone is a gay, but you might say they are gay. Okay. So next is bisexual or bi. And this is kind of an umbrella term for a lot of stuff. So if you've heard the words pansexual or omnisexual, those are generally under this umbrella of bisexuality, right? And while bi implies two, usually what we think of for bisexuality is someone who is attracted to two or more genders, right? And I say that acknowledging that there are more than two genders. I could be very contentious and say there are a world of genders. So bisexuality, that's what it generally means. And again, bisexual is, it's an adjective, right? This person is bisexual, not a bisexual. Some folks might say that about themselves, but usually that's just joking. So don't call someone a bisexual. So T stands for transgender or trans. And generally this means that someone identifies with a gender, so they have a gender identity different from the one expected based on their sex assigned at birth. So if we think of the gender unicorn in the gender identity and sex assigned at birth category, we might see one sex assigned at birth here, and then we look up at the gender identity and it's not the same, right? And that's trans. So you might have heard words like transsexual, right? That's a word that's usually not used anymore. Some folks might identify as transsexual personally, but generally that's not the word you're going to want to use. Okay. Usually we default to the umbrella of just trans, and I see a hand is raised, so I'll get to that in just 1 second, right? So if you're trying to be inclusive of folks, you would ask whether someone is trans as opposed to whether or not they are transsexual or transgender. Because trans includes non-binary people. It includes folks who are gender fluid, meaning that their gender can shift depending on the day or the time. And then gender queer, which are folks who reject the gender binary. Okay. So trans is another umbrella term. You might hear some folks say that there is a difference between binary trans and non-binary trans. Usually that's just a way to cause fighting within the community, but know that that is something that folks sometimes think about. If you've heard words like female to male or male to female, we usually don't use those words anymore. Instead, we might say trans woman, meaning they are a woman who is trans, right? So their gender identity is woman, even if their sex assigned at birth is not. Or you might hear trans man. They identify as a man, their gender identity is man, that's who they are, but they are trans, and they are trans. So their sex assigned at birth does not necessarily match what you might expect. So Q stands for queer or questioning. Questioning is the most obvious. This is someone who is figuring out their gender identity or sexual orientation, right? Their attractions. So if you've heard the word sexual orientation, really that's the attraction component of the gender unicorn. Sexual orientation and attraction are the same in that way. So someone who's figuring it out. Queer is a complicated word in a lot of ways. So number one, queer means weird, and I love that. Kind of the origin, right? But queer was used as a slur for a long time against LGBTQ folks. So if you go up to someone and you say, hey, are you queer? That's really offensive and you might get punched in the face. With the exception of if you are queer and you go up to your best friend who's queer and you say, hey, are you queer? In which case they might laugh at you. So it's a word that it can be used internally within the community, very offhand. But if you are not part of the community, you should not use it unless definitions 3 and 4, someone might identify as queer, which just means not straight and or not cisgender. Okay. Straight meaning, heterosexual, someone attracted to a gender different than their own, usually what they say the opposite. Cisgender, CISGENDER, is someone whose gender identity matches their sex assigned at birth. So if someone was born male and they identify as a man, they are cisgender. He is a cisgender man. You might hear it abbreviated to cis, which is CIS. So, and I'm getting some questions in the chat box. Great. So one question is, how does fluid fit into these categories? So fluid can apply under the bisexual umbrella or the trans umbrella. And usually it's partnered with something. So you might hear someone say they are gender fluid, or they might say my gender is fluid. So usually it's a context clue. Okay. The last definition for queer, just to touch back on that, is the community. So you might hear me, for example, call it the queer communities to refer to all of these letters. Queer is very generational. It's hard to put a number about what that is, but typically someone who is, I would say probably older than millennial, might have a more intensive negative connotation with queer, depending on their association with activism, right? Because it was a slur for so many years. A lot of younger folks are reclaiming queer to take power away from it. So it's very contentious, like I noted, so just be careful. So then I stands for intersex, which I already explained, someone who has a combination of male and female sex characteristics. And then the last one is A. A stands for asexual or aromantic. You might hear these called ace or aro communities. And this means someone who has little to no sexual and or romantic attraction. Okay. So, and I see another question. Great. So by the way, that kind of wraps up the core of the slide. If there are questions about any of these specific things, let's go ahead and answer those before we move on to the next slide. In academia, theory through the LGBTQ lens is referred to as queer theory. Correct. Great. So I'm not hearing any other questions. So that's awesome. Hopefully you all have learned some words that you maybe didn't know, or maybe gotten a little bit more of a conciseness on some words you did. So then the next question is, how will being LGBTQ impact mediations? Right? So for those of you who are currently mediators, or for those of you who want to be mediators, which we'll talk more about that second group at the end of the presentation. For those of you who are mediators or want to be mediators, having a client who's LGBTQ does have an impact. So we're going to explore in what ways. So some of the commonly impacted, what we might call groups or scenarios where queerness impacts mediations are in the realms of family, employment, housing, small claims, neighbors, social media, and community, right? So we're gonna I'm not gonna go through all of them and how it's affected across all of them, but we're gonna start with the most obvious one, which is family, right? When people think about, oh, there's some issue in queer communities, right? A lot of times they're thinking about family. So I'm gonna actually open this up to the group. What are some ways that queerness, whether one's sexual orientation or gender identity, right? How can that impact disputes relating to the family?
I think that it could affect disputes relating to the family because there may be family members that are not understanding or accepting of family members that act differently from the model we grew up with.
Yeah. Yeah. So along that, sorry to put you on the spot. Would you be willing to give me kind of a scenario where that might be in the mediation?
One might be, you might have a teenage.
Mm-hmm.
I'm struggling because I want to be sensitive. You have a teenager who professes to be gay
mm-hmm.
or queer.
Mm-hmm.
It changes, and if you're not fluent in going in and out of these definitions, that's a struggle right there anyway. Yep. And so you say, okay, we accept that. But then when you're going out in public, it appears that this teenager becomes pretty flamboyant mm-hmm. with his behavior that draws a lot of attention. Mm-hmm. And so that could upset certain family members.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe that'll stop to think that some of the things that some of the rest of us do can attract attention also, but you wonder, why are you acting this way when you don't act this way all the time? Mm-hmm. Whereas, you're bouncing back, well, that's a teenager. They irritate you anyway. And just trying to figure out how can you support that person and still not go stark raving mad?
Yeah, right. And you've hit on a lot of different components there. So first I want to note 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. So you're hitting on a very common familial dispute where there's a teenager who comes out and a family who either who are either not accepting or they try to be accepting, but they don't understand how, and in their frustration, it results in a conflict, right? Like you noted, right? Someone, if this teenager is going out and is following stereotypes, the parents might say, well, why are you doing that, right? Instead of trying to understand how are these behaviors related to your identity and how are they not, right? How are they expressing something else? So a lot of times it's more about like honor can come into this type of conversation, among other things. So you're hitting on a really big subject around family mediations, and a very common one. Oftentimes these won't go to mediations, or they're not often coming to a mediation center's door, but these are actually cases that are perfectly ripe for mediation services, right? Because the challenge is a lack of communication.
And if you add any mental health issues in there, you're really going to have a party.
Yeah. And if you think about that game we played, that kind of poker game with our identities, right? It's easy to imagine how one might develop anxiety or depression if you're constantly playing that game. So definitely. So that's a big one, right? The kind of process of coming out. What are some other kind of scenarios where being LGBTQ impacts mediations? Family
So,
mediation.
so Wolf, this is Brad. I mean, I work full time in family court, and so I get to see a lot of this stuff. The legalization of gay marriage is what, just around 5.5 years old at this point. And we're just now seeing the wave of divorces come through family court, like they trickled in, right? Because um, uh, they seem to follow a normal life cycle as heterosexual marriages, but we're also just now starting to see the cases where there's children involved.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've got to deal with these custody issues. And I've worked with judges, and this is no offense to judges. I'm genuinely, I like all the judges I've worked with, but you know, I'm serious. But I've literally seen judges talk after parties have left, because I kind of get this private little time with the judge. It's a very kind of a unique and rare space, but like talk about, you know, this person is a bad person because of piercings or tattoos. Like these are really old, antiquated ideals, okay? And if there's still judges that think about that as far as tattoos and piercings are concerned, you can guarantee that there are judges who still have outdated ideals about who's best for the kid in, you know, these marriages between same-sex or LGBT couples. And so I say all that to say it becomes an incredibly powerful motivator within the mediation space when you can meet with these parties and genuinely tell them they can get a better service through mediation than they can get in a court of law potentially, especially just because of how new this all is. They will get a much better outcome with mediators who are sensitive to LGBT issues. And this works really good to pull down the conflict, because I've worked some really high conflict same-sex marriage cases, but he pulls it down because, like, listen, if you put yourself at the mercy of the judge, you're running a greater risk than the average heterosexual couple is.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that's just one of many. I won't monopolize anything, but that was one of the things that that came to my mind when I was thinking about your question.
Exactly, right. And this is very area dependent. So, you know, St. Louis is sometimes called like the blue bastion of Missouri, if you will, right? But even then, if we're comparing St. Louis to maybe a coast metropolis, right, there's going to be differences in acceptance and attitudes and stereotypes, right? And you are hitting the kind of the nail on the head where we're operating in these complex spheres, right? And so being LGBTQ plays out in that particular way, right? Exactly.
There's this whole, let's say, there's this whole concept of gendered institutions, right? Where institutions are constantly being affected by gendered norms within the community, but at the same time are creating and reinforcing gendered norms. And I'm just not sure, as an LGBT person, I would want to put myself at the mercy of a system that's not quite there yet.
Yes, definitely. And so then I don't want to, you know, take up too much of folks' times around kind of filling out all the other scenarios. But another one that I do want to point out, right, is whenever folks think about LGBTQ challenges, they often rush to the L and the G and often rush to the L and the G, right? So I want us to think about the B and the T for a second, right? What's the impact in a family mediation of one, let's say it's a couple, let's say one person comes out as bisexual, right? That's going to play out within the family context, right? Or you all might be familiar with this idea of folks coming out when they're older, right? When they've been married for 20, 30 years, right? What is that? How does that play out? And another big one is what is the impact of coming out as trans and transitioning? Right? You can think about how different systems might respond to that. You can think about how the other person might be upset. Family members might be upset. Children might be upset. Right? And so mediation is this space for us to process that, but we have to be careful because it's not the space to become a free-for-all feeding frenzy on why can't you just go back in the closet? Or why are you this way? And so it's a real challenge for mediators to balance that. And then another thing that brought up, courts are only set up to acknowledge two parents in custody arrangements, right, which can be exceedingly complicated as we think about polyamory, or we think about families that don't follow the traditional structure. Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. Right. So all of this to say that we think of family as like, oh, well, this makes the most sense. This is where it's going to play out, right? But there's a lot of nuance in the way that it plays out here. And with nuance comes opportunity. So then the next one that I want to just jump to is this idea of bias, right? So bias is the idea in this particular context that the clients that you work with are all going to be cisgender and straight, right? So there's the bias on the mediator's end, and then there's mediation around bias. So if we think of those areas that we looked at before, we can think about how bias plays out. So the first one is employment. I think we all have an idea about how someone who's LGBTQ might experience bias in the workplace and the opportunity for mediation in the employment context. We can think about LGBTQ experiences in housing and their experience of bias. We can think about healthcare and receivement of care. If you haven't heard this before, many trans folks refer to having trans syndrome every time they go to the doctor, because the doctor will say, "Why are you here today?" The trans person will say, "I have a cold," and then the doctor will say, "Is it because you're trans?" And it's kind of a joke among trans folks, but it's a common kind of trope where doctors will say, "Well, how is this related to your gender identity?" Whenever they're coming in for, a sprained ankle or something. Oh, well, is it because you're wearing heels and you're not used to wearing heels? So anyway, there's this long running joke, but it's based on truth around this trans syndrome idea. We can think about bias in the social media space and the way that plays out. We can think about bias among neighbors, in neighborhoods, between tenants of a shared building, especially if they share walls or floors or ceilings. And we can think about community spaces. And so one thing I like to think about is we don't know bias until we see it. So if you're looking at this slide, most of you probably assumed all the lights are off. But it's only by actually thinking about it and acknowledging it that we see that one of them is on. Right? And acknowledgement can be everything. It can be that source of light in a world that can otherwise feel very dark. And so all of that being said, we can also think about the LGBTQ community as a microcosm for issues in the broader kind of environment, right? All of the same things that heterosexual couples have to go through in family mediation, LGBTQ couples may have the same experience, right? Their experiences around what it means to want to have custody of a child, they're probably the same or similar, right? We can think about employment within the community, right? And so LGBTQ folks will experience employment discrimination for other things. If you think about a Black trans woman who goes to work every day, the employer might say, I'm fine with your transness, but it's one of these other identities that I'm not okay with. And we can think about the same context for housing, small claims, neighbors, social media being a big one, right? Where we're thinking about how lots and lots of LGBTQ folk fall on both sides of many social issues. Republican, Democrat, kind of BLM versus Blue Lives Matter versus face mask or not, and vaccines and everything, right? There's this idea that all LGBTQ folks are hyper liberal, but that's just not the truth. And so these broader conversations in society are happening within this microcosm. The difference being that the LGBTQ community probably won't come to an organization unless that organization comes to them first. Just like most other communities, right? If you're working with immigrants, for example, we know that immigrant communities are far less likely to use services unless you actually go to places that are important to that community. And it's going to vary between identities within that space, right? So we also know that there's lots of barriers to service. Just to highlight, these are a few. So number one, homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. This is all the ways that society basically says it's not okay to be LGBTQ. And that's kind of the first piece of this puzzle. The second one is a lack of education. A lot of folks don't know what it means to be LGBTQ because schools don't talk about it. A lot of times the media will only cover it in kind of a surface way. There's not these kinds of in-depth conversations. Number three, non-inclusive resources, right? So resources assuming, right? On paperwork, it might say, or in an email, someone might say, what's your wife's name? Because they assume that this human is married to a woman, right? Because that's what they all are, right? That's all of our clients, right? So this non-inclusive resources. Or if your intake form asks for gender, but it only says male and female, that's a big one, big frustration of mine. That automatically signals to me that I'm not welcome there. The fourth puzzle piece is not being out. So again, it's every time that we show up to a new space, LGBTQ folks have to come out or decide not to. But there are some folks who have not even started coming out to other people, and those folks can be especially difficult to access for services. The fifth one being stigma, right? And this is, again, kind of this societal disapproval of queerness. And then that last one is shame, and that's internal, right? And a lot of this is built on a lot of societal stuff. The big one that you might see, just an example in the family context, is queer parents might not want to talk about what's going on because they have to be perfect. Because if they're not perfect, then they're going to be judged for it. So this kind of model minority idea, if you're familiar with that. Okay. Real quick, there is a chat. With the forms, what do you suggest the options be changed to instead of male-female? How can we be more open? Great question. So number one, I would say, what are you asking for? Are you asking for sex or gender? And if you're not a medical provider, you probably don't need to know sex, right? And if you're asking for gender, kind of why, right? So that's kind of question one. Question two is, are you willing to allow folks to just write down what they identify as? If the answer is yes, I suggest eliminating a checkbox and putting a fill in the blank. And, you'll put examples like man, non-binary, etc., right? And then a fill in the blank model. I've actually done research with queer communities, and I specifically assessed the impact of that, of a fill in the blank versus checkbox. And it resulted in significantly more approval ratings and significantly more self-identification and comfort. Great. Okay, and so then the follow-up question is a question around COVID testing and the choices being male, female. So we may need to have a blank line as you suggest. Yeah, and I think that's certainly an odd space, right? Medical has its own kind of best practice guidelines there. But typically those types of tests, the male-female question is usually not related to the service being rendered. If it is, and it has to be there, then just explain it, is what I usually see. So for example, doctors are starting to have their techs, when they go into the room to gather information, say, I'm going to be gathering your demographics. Question number one, what's your biological sex? We have to ask this of all patients since it may impact your test results. And it impacts your lines, okay? And then the next question is, okay, great, thank you for answering that. As a follow-up matter, what are your pronouns? We want to make sure that that we are addressing you respectively. So if you do have this component of forced dichotomy or forced choice, then you can partner it with something that is more open, that shows kind of a cultural acceptance. So one of the things I like to say is, whenever it comes to creating inclusive services, identity matters, but not too much. So kind of like the trans syndrome for the doctors, right? Trans identity is important, but if you're making it the star of every show, then it makes us feel less human, right? So we can think about the ways to flag inclusiveness without forcing folks to feel tokenized or reduced to an identity. So for example, I would not suggest that you open mediations with, hello, my name is Wolf, what is your sexual orientation? Right? Instead, I could say, hello, my name is Wolf. My pronouns are they, them, and then move into my statement. Because by saying my pronouns, I'm inviting folks to share theirs if they want to, but I'm not forcing it. Or as I did in Zoom, I put my name and my pronouns there. Sometimes folks will see that and they'll be like, oh, I need to put mine in there, right? And which I think is a good thing overall, right? But it's a very simple way to just show folks that, number one, you know what pronouns are, and number two, you're willing to make them explicit. Because the alternative is that you're taking pronouns for granted. And when you take pronouns for granted, it means you're relying on assumptions. And there's not much more frustrating than someone making a lot of assumptions about you when the assumptions are wrong. As I'm sure everyone in this room has experienced during their lifetime, of people assuming X, Y, or Z about you. So across a variety of things. So those are two big ones. Another common one is the use of a rainbow flag in a small way. So if you have a physical space, do you have a rainbow flag somewhere? If clients are coming in, obviously right now that's a little different, right? I'm not going to be like, make your Zoom logo a rainbow flag or anything like that, right? But LGBTQ folks ranked a small rainbow flag at the entrance of service as one of the #1 ways that they look for to show that a service is inclusive. So the survey I did had over 1,300 folks. 60% of LGBTQ folks ranked that as their #1 choice around whether or not a service is inclusive. For trans folks, their #1 choice was, does the organization talk about or ask for pronouns? So those are some organizational steps and a little bit of personal, but also some additional components of the personal are based of what we call harm reduction, which is built out of it's built out of addicts and working with folks who have chronic addictions. And it's the idea that we live in a society that has a lot of harm happening, right? There's a lot of messages around LGBTQ folks not being welcome. And so we can't eliminate harm, but we can reduce it. And the ways that we do that are, #1, don't impose your own values or opinions. Now that's central to mediation. And sometimes mediators forget that it's very important when working with LGBTQ folks, right? #2, don't ask questions not relevant to the situation or services. Avoid the trans syndrome problem. If someone's having a conversation about something completely unrelated, don't say, well, how's this related to your being trans? They're gonna probably stare at you, be a little offended. #3, use gender neutral language when possible, right? So instead of saying, tell me about your wife or husband, you might say, tell me about your partner. Tell me about your son or daughter, tell me about your child. Tell me about your boyfriend or girlfriend. Partner is still appropriate there. #4, don't make assumptions. If someone says that they're gay, if someone says that they are a gay man and then they're married to a woman, right? Don't assume that he's been deceiving her this whole time, right? We don't know. There's a lot of context we don't know. Next, ask people for their pronouns, right? So again, this could either be something that you ask all folks or something that you include in your introduction, right? This is especially true for intake, for example, or the first time that you're interacting with someone. Next, know that identifying as LGBTQ is not just about sex. There's a community of LGBTQ people, and we have a whole fabulous, vibrant culture with a lot of components. And many LGBTQ folks are in that community, and many avoid it like the plague, which is probably not a good phrase to use anymore, since we've now learned that people are not good at avoiding plagues. So, but all this to say that if you ask someone, well, have you heard of RuPaul? That is going to be offensive, unless it's part of this kind of casual conversation about things you were watching. So anyway. Next, many people who engage in sex with the same gender will not identify as LGBTQ. So if that's part, and this can sometimes come up in mediations, right? Where someone's like, well, I'm not that, or I am that, but that's not how this works. It's not gonna be helpful to fight them on it. Just accept it and move on. And then the last one is to listen and mirror, which is, again, a fundamental mediation skill, but so important. If someone is talking about their partner using they, them pronouns, and you gender their partner, they will see that, right? So if you're talking to someone and you think, they're talking about their partner and how awful their partner is or whatever, and you see them and you're like, oh, this person looks like a woman, right? I assume that they're dating a man. Like, oh, well, what did your boyfriend say next, right? That person hears that. Right. So it's important to mirror the language folks use. Great. And then there's another question that came in. Do you have any suggestions for a respectful gender neutral alternative to sir or ma'am? There is a formal one, which is mer. So you might say, thank you, mer, which is, I think it's cute. Most folks don't use it. The honorific, like Mr. or Miss, is mix. So I would be Mix Smith. To be candid, most folks don't know or use those. So I try to recommend removing gendered language as much as possible. Right? Thank you, sir, versus thank you is usually not, and if, this is cultural, right? So for folks who are raised in the South, where sirring and ma'aming is very important, right? Step number one, try to remove gendered language or replace it. And in terms of a replacement, you know, this is kind of a big question depending on kind of cultural specific norms. If you're unable to replace or remove, then using the one that folks attribute to their gender. Right? So if you're expressly saying your pronouns when you meet someone, and then your culture has ingrained sir and ma'am, then use the one that they are suggesting or that aligns with their identity. Does that make sense? I realize that was kind of a ranty way to explain it, but it's just at its core, be respectful of how someone identifies.
I have a question.
Yep. Oh, you're a little quiet.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
If you, yeah, that's better.
Okay, I had my headphones in still, but I took forget that. Anyway, so when we do mediations, first thing we ask people, how do you want to be addressed?
Yep.
Right. And usually they think that means by their name. Should we rephrase that in some kind of way or add to that question when we do a mediation?
Great question. I would say that if you're asking that question, but you've already said your pronouns, then I think that's enough. So if for example, you might, or I might say, thank you for being here. My name's Will Smith. My pronouns are they and them. You know, I want to make sure I'm respecting you all, or I want to make sure I'm addressing you all respectfully. How would you like to be addressed? And then they'll say their name, or they might say pronouns. Usually, trans folks know that they're trans. And so the vast majority of us know that when someone is asking these types of questions, you know, I mean, we're not forgetting about our transness. So we know what the intent is there. I would say the vast majority of times. For folks who are not trans, usually they don't know so much, or maybe they don't, right? And so usually they'll just kind of glaze over it or make it a not big deal. And in those cases, then no one's being harmed by you continuing along with their assumption. So awesome. So we're going to move into the questions section.